Professor Konstantin Mazantsev, and that his lecture is a part of the EUniWell Open Lecture Series, and Professor Konstantin Mazantsev, will be speaking about Urbicide, everyday life, and post-war urban healing. Actually, let me introduce once again our speaker, Konstantin Mazantsev. He's a professor and head of the Department of Economic and Social Geography at Taras Shevchenko National University of Kyiv. And his recent research examines the transformation of post-Soviet urban regions and cities, public spaces and new building gentrification, suburban development, urban geopolitics, and IDPS issues. And actually, Professor Konstantin Mazantsev is involved into the international multidisciplinary research project on Ukrainian geopolitical fault line cities, urban identities, geopolitics, and urban policy. Professor Konstantin Mazantsev, as well as head of Kyiv Department of the Ukrainian Geographical Society. And frankly speaking, has today's lecture, the topics of today's lecture is extremely urgent nowadays for Ukraine due to the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine. And in this lecture, we will discuss the everyday impact of herbicide on cities and people, and how can we cope and how can we deal with all these negative influences that unfortunately our country has and experiences nowadays. You have the opportunity to put your questions into the Q&A box, in our case that is chat, and at the end of the lecture we'll be happy to answer your questions. So Professor Konstantin Mazantsev, the floor is yours. You're very welcome.
Thank you very much, Ludmila. First of all, I'm thankful to organizers for such opportunity to participate in a great event. And I would like to start my lecture with a bit different three main focuses. First one, we will discuss Urbicide and different impacts of war in the world and in particular in Ukraine. But another important aspect is concerning urban trauma and traumatized city as a result of war. And then we shift our attention to urban reconstruction and more interesting avenue to urban healing, towards health city, towards well-being city, towards post-Urbicide world. And of course, under this way, another aspect that will be discussed is difficult heritage, places of shame and sorrow, places that need to be memorialized as an impact or consequence of Urbicide, and then some conclusions. So, firstly, Urbicide, war, and the city. Global geopolitical confrontations manifest in individual cities, and global violence telescopes within and through local places, along with the implosion of global politics into the urban world. Warfare is also being urbanized. And of course, war in the city, not a new topic for studies. The first book devoted to war in the city was published in early 90s, and last one just last year, also with the main focus on war in the city, war victims and right to a city, with different papers and books devoted to different impacts of war on the city and by the city. Urbicide, just umbrella term that used to understand different destructive impacts of the war. Different scholars proposed a set of concepts to understand this phenomenon: ruralization, murder of the city, extreme urbicide, place annihilation, different terroristic attacks, architecture, identicide, and so on, so on. It's a long list of different terms, but united with the same idea of deliberate destruction of the built environment, as Forward in his great prominent book has generalized. First of all, Urbicide is about killing and about city. The main idea, destruction of urban, the killing of urbanity, the killing of the urban style of life, of urban living, of urban, not just environment, but also urban life in general. And let's firstly look back to main explanation of Urbicide and the different concepts and different forms of Urbicide. From the Second World War, it was paid attention to a total destruction of many cities. And Hewitt proposed, coined the term place annihilation to explain this phenomenon as simultaneous destruction of ordinary residents and their communities, public spaces and neighborhoods, and in fact the loss of meaning of destroyed places. The destruction of the collective and national identity of some places, spaces that constitute an important feature of the urban. And later, Abu Jidi proposed another term, extreme urbicide, for such destruction of city. And in post Second World War times, another attention was paid to urbicide in times of Afghan war, when Soviet Union destructed a lot of Afghan cities. And Goodson later in the early 2000s proposed term ruralization. Why ruralization? Because it was the tactics of military operation when virtually everything has been a target in order to suppress the resistance of completely different cultural, political, and ethnic group. If you are protest to some political regimes, you will be destroyed with all homes, with all buildings in your city. Just city will be converted into rubbles. In post-Cold War era, Urbicide mostly associated with intrastate armed conflicts in the collapse in Yugoslavia, Russia, and the Middle East. In early 90s, Bogdanovich named this phenomenon as ritual murder of the city. And term ritual is very important to understand why some city like Vukovar, as a picture you can see at the slide, so brutally destructed. And also at the same time, in times of former Yugoslavia wars, Sarajevo Association of Architects coined the term architecture, war in architecture, to show how war destroys the architecture. When buildings are attacked, not because they are in the path of a military objective as a collateral damage or something else, or military targets, but because they are the objectives, the main objective to destruct, to destroy architecture in the city, important masterpieces. And then Herscher proposed to shift from a war on architecture to a war by architecture. When architecture is not just as a victim, but as a tool to impact on the city. Later in 2000s, analyzing different and other aspects of Urbicide, Mahag coined the term indenticide as a destruction of vernacular and symbolic places during the war with the intention to erase cultural identity and a sense of belonging. And in some cases, when World Heritage objects are destructed, Mahak proposed to use term cultural cannibalism and destructed a breach in Mostar. From one side, it's really an act of identicide when the common city was divided into parts. And this bridge is a famous bridge and culture heritage. And in this case, it also culture cannibalism. The same cases we can find everywhere in the world. And when we shift our attention to homes, in this case, we could talk about extreme domicide, as Porter and Smith proposed to name, the deliberate destruction of homes in order to leverage against enemy governments, or terrorize civilians so that they lose faith in their own cause. In case of nowadays war in Ukraine, domicide, also important part of this war, because domicide, the loss of homes, is one of more visible aspect of the war. But last events like explosion and destruction of Kakhovskaya power station in Ukraine is a case of spatiocide, as Hanafi in 2009 introduced this term. Spatiocide is about not only destruction of cities, but also the whole landscape and built environment, resulting with not only destroyed or damaged buildings, but leveled hillsides, flattened vegetation. It is aimed to erase other resistant identity from certain areas against agonistic heterogeneity and alterity. And another side of Urbicide is related to nowadays so-called asymmetric wars, when some oppositional forces fighting against the ruling party or different political powers divide the city into different parts, and as a result, fragmentation of urban space, like in Beirut, as studied by Sarah Fregonese in 2000s. Also, it's about Urbicide, but another side of Urbicide, not just destruction of building, but destruction of city space, open city space, when you are afraid to go to another part of the city, and because of different checkpoints, different gangs that control different parts. And finally, acts of campaign of terror in cities outside of Ukraine. Mostly after terroristic attack in New York in the famous September masterpiece and iconic buildings in New York, it was also idea to discuss it through the lens of Urbicide as a deliberate, even if supposedly incidental, targeting of cities, seeking to destroy the security, public order, civility, and quality of life of all their citizens, and damage of destroy the viability and livability of the city itself. It's mostly about direct Urbicide, when some parts of the city or city totally destructed by bombing, by shelling, by street fighting and different ways. At the same time, Abuji and some other scholars proposed to talk not just about direct Urbicide, but as well indirect Urbicide. Abuji discussed two different ways of indirect Urbicide. One, by construction, concerning post-war, post-Urbicide development, when construction of temporary housing, refugee camps, IDP camps in many different cities, even in other countries, is also such kind of decaying of some areas, of stigmatization of some areas because of more concentration of forced migrants settling there. Like this huge refugee camp near city of Zaatari, when the number of population is such, refugee camp with any facilities and amenities and with low access to basic social services is a threat for nearest city because of huge tension from this area. And in this case, this stigmatized and how to say present in media as a criminalized or area of potential violence is important side of development of the main city. The same situation with different temporary housing construction in Urbicide cities as well. Because of course, if some homes or houses are destroyed, you need new ones. And the fastest way to build a new house and with a low quality, with the fastest way. But then it's a new challenge for city to have new spaces that will be stigmatized because of concentration of low-income people, people with disability, and so on. And in this way, it's also urbicide, but indirect. Another side of indirect urbicide by Abugidi is by control. When different kinds of city divisions, their internal separation, weakening bindings, installation of numerous checkpoints, and loss of access to certain parts of the city. To some extent, it's in the same line with Fragonese proposed talk about fragmentation of urban space under asymmetric laws. But in that case, urbicide direct combined with indirect, but it's this kind. It's no destruction, but about city management, about public spaces in city, about community, when community is divided, when public spaces are closed, and so on. You can see it's a long list of different sides, different forms, and different concepts of urbicide. But we can identify some common features of urbicide, like such. First one, deliberate targeting of city is not selective, since it concerns all residents, not any individual ethnic or social group, without distinction by social status or political preferences. Second, the deliberate, not as collateral damage, destruction of symbolic places and buildings important for ethnic or national identities combined with the destruction of mundane, ordinary spaces and buildings in which everyday practices of ordinary people are embedded. Third, urbicide is characterized by the destruction of physical, tangible parts, as well as intangible features, both built environment and values of liberty, values of civility, values of diversity, coexistence, assault on the values of civilization more general. Fourth, urbicide is aimed at killing the heterogeneous urbanity for its own sake, the destruction of urban life that encourages the presence of others, and where diversity is deeply rooted in architecture and urban space. And fifth, last but not least, deliberate, even carefully planned destruction of cities reconfigures urban spaces in unexpected ways. So, what's about urbicide in Ukraine? Is it a new story from a long list of well-covered literature on urbicide, or something new that needs to be reconsidered, re-understand with new manifestation and new results and consequences of these processes? As for me, it's in fact another case that, first of all, because of the scale of this urbicide, It's the largest ongoing war in the 21st century. It concerns not about 1, 2, 3, 10 cities, but about hundreds of cities, more than 400 cities, and the Urbicide just now. It's a huge scale of Urbicide at the same time in a vast area. This is not a recreation of one of the previous scenarios of Urbicide. It's a new planned but outrageously implemented project. Radical destruction of Mariupol and Popasna, the wanton massacre in Bucha and Izium, and everyday destruction of Kharkiv, Mykolaiv, Kyiv, Dnipro, Kryvyi Rih, and so on, a various manifestation of direct Urbicide, but non-military destruction of the occupied cities in Ukraine and indirect Urbicide. So it's an overlapping of different sides, of different forms of Urbicide. Therefore, it needs to understand how it happened and why. First of all, how? Just in the first 100 days of the active phase, full-on phase of the war, from the February 24, 1/3 of all Ukrainian cities were directly or deliberately destroyed. 27 cities were destroyed by shell and bombing or street fighting every 10 days. 7 cities at least every fourth day. And 4 cities at least every second day. It's a really huge scale. And next days, all map of Ukraine are red because of Urbicide expanded throughout the country. Why Urbicide in Ukraine happened? Different explanation we can use from generalization by Pollard or some other scholars. The simplest way to explain Urbicide as used by aggressor country, military necessary actions or collateral damage. As for me, answer no, it's not an explanation for these processes. According to the security service of Ukraine, only every 20th missile strike of the Russian Federation was directed at a military facility. The remaining 19 targeted houses, schools, hospitals, universities, like hospital in Slovyansk or school in Kharkiv. It's not collateral damage and not necessary action, military necessity. Another explanation that used to understand Urbicide, the cultural cleansing or more radical cultural cannibalism aimed at symbolic buildings that are important for Ukrainian identity, for the places of culture heritage of the country. Yeah, some of such places were destructed. First of all, monuments devoted to anti-terroristic operation to Ukrainian leaders and some universities. Iconic buildings also, or like in Kharkiv, were destructed. But the targets of destruction most often become schools, ordinary schools, hospitals, residential and utility buildings, ordinary everyday public spaces. It's not about cultural cleansing, not about cultural cannibalism, not about identity. It's something else, but partly it could be an explanation. Another explanation, written otherness, also partly. If we compare these two maps with the share of Ukrainian as a native language and number of days of shell and bombing in the first 100 days of full-on stage of the war, you can see just some relation and similarity between these maps. But to be Ukrainian, or in some city, the share of Ukrainian speaking population is higher, it's not a course to be more Urbicide, to be more bombing or shelling. It's just with some similarities, but not in general. And it means that in most of city and more suffered city with higher population of Russians as native language or even in ethnicity, it means that otherness, it's also not an explanation. Howard proposed to talk about metaphoric interpretation of Urbicide under the view of concept at stake in the war. Analyzing the Balkan War, he discussed the concept important for that times at that region. But in our case, what are the main concepts that used by Russian forces and Russian politicians? First of all, concept of Russian vote, promoted by most of pro-Russian forces. But dwellers are killed during bombing and shelling, regardless of their ethnicity, language, or even geopolitical preferences. Of course, we can think about some symbolism in case of Kharkiv, when on March 1st, 2014, it was installed the Russian flag on the building of regional state administration. And exactly 8 years later, this building was held by Russian forces. Maybe a Russian flag is some kind of sign that this building will be destroyed, but not about Russian world in general. Another metaphoric interpretation consider concept of artificial creation of Ukraine, like Bosnia and Herzegovina, the same way. Some politicians use this idea of artificial bridging of essentially different parts of Ukraine and importance of so-called Novorossiya project. But O'Loughlin and co-authors and later Kuzio shows that the Novorossiya project failed because it's a myth used by Russian political technologists and has little basis in reality. And these maps were very impressive because the first map usually used to show Ukraine is a divided country, divided state, and of course part of Ukraine will be liberated, of course, in Russian way understanding of this term. And yeah, you can see this divide between two candidates on at presidential election in 2010. But if you look 4 years later, it's no division. It's the same situation in Ukraine. And at the last presidential election, the same situation. Mostly, it's an urban level. It's a level of cities results of presidential election, and you can see no divide. And then more conventional explanation is heterogeneity, destruction of heterogeneity, destruction of this side of urban life. Heterogeneity is the essence of urbanity, as Howard and Ristich later mentioned. Yeah, Ukrainian cities are heterogeneous in various aspects, in terms of geopolitical preferences, beliefs, and native language, and such coexistence was the norm. Like in Kharkiv, you can see at the same time monument with Ukrainian flag and sign "Glory to Ukraine" and mural and monument to Soviet times military leader Zhuk. It's from different geopolitical preferences, pro-Soviet and pro-European sides. But it's not about targeting heterogeneity. It's something else. And as for me, one of new side of Urbicide in Ukraine, targeting the actual development of cities, growing civic consciousness, and public activism, it's an explanation. We conducted a set of interviews with dwellers of eastern part of Ukraine cities, from eastern part, and last interview were conducted just 1 week before full stage of the war in February. And what this interview showed, first of all, improvement of public spaces, new construction, increase in entrepreneurial activity, the strengthening of civil society, local activism, and community cohesion. We can talk about some kind of opposing vectors of change in the occupied city and neighboring liberated city. Some of eastern Ukrainian city were occupied in 2014 and then liberated. And nowadays we can, before February 2022, especially, it was some kind of different vision of two sides of the city. Decline and destruction on occupied territories and development and renewal in another. Grayness in occupied and brightness, colorfulness in another. There and then it was Donetsk 2014 and now are two completely opposite things. And Kramatorsk 2014 and Kramatorsk 2022 are two different cities. After 2014, it began to change for the better. It changed 100 times, as one of our interviews mentioned. And one more explanation, that idea of Soviet nostalgia, of Russian world values and so on, disappearing in such city, and they feel more and more Ukrainian and pro-Ukrainian, with advanced vision of their city. And that's why reason to destroy the city, because they find far from Soviet nostalgia and from Russian values. And concerning indirect urbicide in Ukraine, concerning construction, IDP camps, it doesn't matter, as for me. Yes, some of IDP camps are located on the city outskirts with fences sometimes, but it's not about huge areas that have an impact on neighboring areas. Why? Because it's just 1 or around 1% of the total number of IDP living in such areas. Most of them are disseminated around the cities. And in this case, it's not about indirect urbicide. But indirect urbicide is more visible from our interviews in cities under occupation because of depopulation, residents outflow, because they have no vision on prospects there, and there remained mostly retirees who had nowhere to go. Because of planned or unconscious destruction of the city's infrastructure, neglect of buildings and so on, fragmentation of the urban space, ineffectiveness of city management, the lack of strategy and real project for city development. So it's a one side. Another side concerning urban trauma and traumatized city. Urban trauma usually considered as a condition where conflict or catastrophe or disaster has disrupted and damaged not only the physical environment and infrastructure of a city, but also the social and cultural networks. Trauma, in general, universal, but its forms are varied. Different traumatic events happened in different cities. In some cases, we can talk like Corbin last recent book on urban trauma and urban healing, where he discussed urban trauma as a result of poverty, community and domestic violence, food and housing, insecurity, and so on. Just everyday issues of the city. But as for me, urban trauma is more about essential events like natural and man-made disaster, like Chernobyl disaster in Ukraine and COVID pandemic, when some parks, some green spaces were closed. It was essential trauma. And nowadays, it's about war against the city, war in the city, and war by the city. Like this picture from Kyiv suburbia, the same playground with 3 different visions from Chernobyl, after post-Chernobyl time, post-COVID and under COVID, and under times of war. And traumatized city is a phenomenon when every dweller couldn't see the trauma. It's not about my trauma, but total. It's a trauma for city, for community. It's traumatized city, not just referring the experiences of individuals. Entire communities often experience trauma. Some cities completely destroyed, Some rules reshape the city's memory rather than engendering much change in everyday life. And displace a traumatized city where people from one community move to another. It's a new phenomenon, like Mariupol community moved into city of Lviv. And it's traumatic history for such community. But for example, in city of Kharkiv, some neighborhood are distracted, but another continue everyday life. Of course, adapting to everyday shelling and bombing, but everyday practices is more how to say, typical, not visible signs of destruction of this everyday life, but with urban trauma, with community trauma. In our interviews, we identify several types of emotional effects, traumatized effects of the war in Ukraine. First of all, of course, the physical and mental trauma. But more interesting, the most frequently used term was radical change. It's not about trauma, it's about radical change. Another one is the fears and anxieties. And one more about memories and political lessons. Concerning trauma and radical change, just some example of quotation from our interviews. Life has changed dramatically. Well, not a life trauma. All my plans were ruined. What would have happened without the war has changed dramatically. This is a shock for me and for my family. No trauma, a radical change of life. And like that, because they change their house and living condition, jobs, lost their jobs or change their sphere of employment because of some shift in income level, up, down, or upward or downward, or change in personal and even family life. Trauma is a fears and anxiety. Refers to different sides. One side from threats to their lives and lives of their relatives. Some fears, of course, because of threats by shelling, bombing, and street fighting, and kidnapping, and so on. And another one from uncertainties of the future of the city. It's a trauma. Well, not just a physical one. It's more of an emotional one. When you lived in your city, you always felt safe. And when it really struck, it was tough. It was very scary, a constant fear that this will happen again. More fears, more wars, more understanding that we can lose each other. And one more scenario or vision of trauma as a memories and as a lesson. As this is not about trauma, but about politics, about lessons. Russian aggression has definitely become a life trauma for me. This is a life lesson. This is a crazy life lesson. How truth triumphs over evil, how good overcomes evil. And taking into account this context of urbicide, context of urban trauma, how we should think about urban reconstruction. Urban reconstruction is the first way to reconstruct urban space, but instant reconstruction is a threat of new trauma because of instant changing of city space, because of instant changing of even social structure of dwellers, of housing stock, and so on. But at the same time, thinking about reconstruction, we should think about for whom it will be reconstructed. Who will be back in the city? Old dwellers, part of former dwellers, newcomers like IDPs, or for whom we should reconstruct. And in this tone, we should think about not just physical reconstruction, but about reconstruction of urban health, about urban healing. And I like to use such term, not reconstruction, but about healing, to combat trauma, to combat radical change in the life of someone who changed city or who plan to be returning to prevent fears, to protect memory. And in this case, we should propose some planning approach, like post-traumatic urbanism, and urban planning approach that involves a balanced combination of urban development with healing war wounds and trauma. Should the city be restored in its previous state? Should new construction be carried out next to wartime ruins? How to solve the IDPs issue? How to strike a balance between turning the aftermath of war into a tourist attraction and focusing on post-war trauma? It's a long list of questions that we should solve under post-traumatic urbanism approach. When Kramatorsk, city of Kramatorsk, was liberated from temporary occupation in 2014, all of wounds or destruction in the city were restored. Physically, it was no visible aspects. The same in Slavyansk. Firstly, visiting this area with destructed hospital, it was very impressive. But next time it was demolished and new area was arranged with new rebuilt building. But it's positive. But at the same time, we should think about risks of functional and spatial mismatch, islandization, copy-paste project, the long list of new post-urbicide, post-military urbicide, new urbicide, some kind of indirect. And when we talk about urban healing, and we should take into account not just reconstruction of physical space, but also think about urban health, how to deal with this issue, how to combat with lack of affordable housing, ineffective urban transportation, poor waste of management, contamination, urban heat islands because of lack of green spaces, of public spaces, lack of cycling infrastructure, and so on. It's not just about restoration or renovation. It's a chance to change city on the way to urban health, to urban city. The best health indicators in all city exist alongside with the worst, of course, and we should protect to convert our urbicide city into spatially unequal cities. We should think about healthy dwellers, healthy community, and to hear the voices of all urban communities. And as for me, such a nice term should be used to think about future of our city, to think about well-being city, health well-being city, putting well-being at the center of urban policy and planning, putting people at the heart of planning for all, with green spaces, low crime rate, effective healthcare system, healthy and diverse neighborhoods. And finally, last point, difficult heritage. Difficult, dissonant heritage, places of pain and shame, also raised a lot of different questions. First of all, how and who will interpret urbicide? Who decides what happened in a particular place to memorialize? What should be memorialized of the consequences of urbicide? Traditional monuments, traditional great symbols of victory, heroism, monuments to national leaders and military heroes, or new types of memorial sites like counter monuments, anti-memorials, abstract memorials, usually conceptual, unfinished and temporary object of space designed to provoke. Will be it about huge monuments like Almaty or Berlin with monuments devoted Second World War, or something creative like in Rotterdam monument to destroyed city, or examples from city of Kramatorsk with a monument to young guy who was killed in city of Donetsk just because of Ukrainian flag, or such landing combat vehicle, or similar to Sarajevo's roses in memory of bloody roses when we can signs of shelling or bombing on the roads. The same hashtag and the same movement is emerging in city of Kramatorsk, like wallflowers, or temporary monuments, or Banksy effect, when famous graffiti painter visiting the city and leave some signs in distracted area. And I passed this place. It was just after he or she painted this graffiti. It was distracted area. Then it was some kind of touristification with a shelter, and then glass box around this Banksy graffiti. It's some kind of touristification of Urbicide. And is it right way? I'm not sure. And some conclusions. Urbicide in Ukraine is not just another story in a long list of well-covered destroyed cities. Targets the actual development, growing civic consciousness, and public activism. Its opposite orientation, we can consider opposite orientation of the development of occupied and neighboring liberated city, causing the brutality of the deliberate destruction of most successful cities when disinformation doesn't work. You can talk about propaganda, can talk about everything, but you can see the city are changing, that decay. Occupied city are indirectly urbicide with depopulation, planned or unconscious destruction of the infrastructure, fragmentation of the urban space, and ineffectiveness of city management. And some lessons of post-urban reconstruction and healing. Prospects to overcome the consequences of urbicide are related to the search for effective post-war recovery strategies for both destroyed, directly urbicided, and temporarily occupied, indirectly urbicide cities. Don't separate urban space and urban residents. Reconstruction plus repopulation. For whom it will be reconstruction? Destroyed, damaged urban space plus traumatized dwellers plus IDPs. Post-urbicide is still traumatized city, and we should propose some kind of trauma-informed placemaking for our city to prevent non-military new build urbicide after military one, to restore the city as a home for the dwellers who have changed, healthy, well-being city. And finally, memorialization of the urbicide should be about funding of social understanding how and who will interpret the war and urbicide to memorialize, to break away from traditional memorials, to prevent excessive touristification of the urbicide, to preserve the memory of urban trauma. Thank you very much for your attention. Sorry, I was a bit longer.
No, that's okay. Everything's fine. Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for such a fascinating, really, lecture and presentation, and for this, really foreign thing by you. So thank you so much. Yes, and we have questions. So the first one: what is the usual fate of cities victims in urbicide cities in the world?
Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, for questions and concerning the fate of cities victims. It's not about just one or two or three scenarios. It's different kinds of urbicide and different ways how to deal with urbicide consequences. One city are preserved, or part of the city are preserved for next generation, to show these results of urbicide, to show for next generation, for foreigners, what's happened in their city. Another side, to demolish all semi-destroyed and destroyed buildings and to recover city with new vision. It's a different scenarios for different countries. And as for me, it's, of course, we should think about some lessons from urbicide around the world. But in case of Ukraine, it's a bit another way. And we should find how to deal with this heritage, urbicide heritage. Because, first of all, urbicide is ongoing. It's not a process that stopped or finished, terminated. It's an ongoing process. And should we reconstruct cities that under risk of new shelling and bombing? Or no? It's a broader discussion now in Ukrainian society and among scholars. And my answer, yes, we should think, taking into account, for example, experience of city of Rotterdam from the Second World War and so on. A different fate of cities victims.
Thank you so much. And one more question. Is there any common medicine for urban healing?
Yeah. When I proposed one time once such topic on urban healing, it was a joke from my colleague from organizing committee. He said, we put your presentation into session on medicine geography, not urban geography, but on medicine geography. Why? Because you talk about healing. To some extent, it's about some medicine for our cities, but it's rather about urban health and health urbanization. When we use new or more effective urban planning approaches, what is the common for every urbicide city, if we talk about urbicide? First of all, we should take into account trauma. Even if some dwellers don't consider it's a trauma, it's about traumatized city. And it's a position number one, how to deal with trauma. And trauma is really some kind of illness for city, and is the first step to communicate with locals, to communicate with dwellers, and to involve them into reconstruction of city. It's important now, and it was discussion with architects, with urban planners, and so on in Ukraine concerning, should we just have some solution for today or even for yesterday to change something in city? And architects, urban planner will propose, and we will done it. But without community, it will be new trauma. It will be a new urbicide for cities. And just now we should open such communication between community and between authorities, city authorities, and just such way. And of course, the next long way of such aspects concerning how to deal with difficult heritage, how to deal with destructed and semi-destructed buildings, like in Kyiv, that when mayor said, "Oh, this building we should demolish a historical building, heritage." Why? Because it's no more liable. But if we will do such way without communication with community, it will be new tension, new conflicts. And to protect such situation, we should communicate, and the main way to think about participatory urban planning and participatory urban healing as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. Do we have any other questions? No? Thank you. Thank you so much. So dear visitors or dear EUniWell family, I would like to express my gratitude, first of all, to our lecturer, and secondly, to you for joining us. And we do hope and we really believe that this urban healing will be as smooth as possible, not only in Ukraine, but in other countries. Thank you so much, and join us in another sessions from our EUniWell Alliance. Thank you so much. Have a nice day and goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you and goodbye.